Welcome to Rock That Relationship, a podcast about all things relationship with Corey and Tracy.
Now let's get real and start creating relationships that rock.
Welcome everyone to Rock That Relationship. We are here today to talk again about thriving in relationships. Who doesn't want to thrive in a relationship, right? We are excited to have on today Dagmar Kusiak, who's going to talk with us about cracking the code on healthy relationships. And, you know, I'm really excited about this particular episode because Dagmar and I have been going back and forth for quite a while to try to make the magic happen and be able to make this show happen. And so we have so many great questions and cannot wait to find out some cool ideas to crack that code. So Dagmar, thanks so much for being on with us today. And we're really excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here too. And to your point, I'm glad that we could finally meet. I know we were going back and forth and had some technical glitches with the program we were using to connect, the Matchmaker FM, but I'm just glad we're able to be here. And I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to hear from you. And maybe we could start off by just having you tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to your work. So kind of frame us. Why are we here with you today?
Yes. Well, what I always introduce myself as is I'm the nerd that turned to coach because my background is actually in computer science and IT. That's actually how everything started in my journey. And for me, I was in the wrong profession completely. I'm Eastern European. So you become a doctor, you become an engineer. There's certain routes that you're supposed to follow, right? Certain paths. And nobody would have said, oh, become a relationship coach. If I would have even told my family that, they would have definitely been very disappointed in me. So for me, the way it turned out was I have always been interested in people. I've always been interested in psychology. It was kind of deep down into my subconscious. I didn't really know that was an interest until later. And I got into becoming a relationship coach recently because I was in a relationship for a couple of years and I no longer was engaged. We were 6 months from getting married. And that was back in 2014.
Wow.
And we had already sent the invitations out. We had paid for everything and it wasn't happening. And I really believe in tapping into the subconscious because for me, what it was is in my dreams, I started getting screams like, you cannot marry this person. You cannot marry this person. And I didn't understand all of that.
Wow.
I didn't understand it.
Like in your dreams when you're actually sleeping and you'd wake up and remember?
Yeah, literally sleeping. Yes. And I was being poisoned. I was being, he was doing things sneaky behind my back in my dreams. And I didn't really understand all of that, but I was like, okay, what does this mean? Because I do believe in God. And I was like, God, what does this mean? What is going on for me? And I realized after the fact, after I did not go through with the wedding and stopped that relationship, and I went through a lot of pain, I realized what it was is I still had daddy issues. Like I was gonna be marrying someone close to my dad. I'm not saying exactly, but similar issues. And that's what really stopped. I ended up going through lots of therapy and all that, but none of the answers really came to me until I really delved into attachment theory and understanding how we attach to people. That's really what ended up changing me is getting into attachment. And I wish therapists were more attuned to that and understood that, because I think if everybody understood attachment and understand how their behaviors have shaped them or their experiences have shaped them, they would really be able to have healthier relationships. And that's kind of where I started.
That's what we say. That's what we start out with in season 1 or season 2 with an attachment coach came on and talked about that. And I always talk about this. I didn't understand any of that. I was married to a psychologist for 8 years and I could not understand anything she was saying. Like it just did not compute until I read the book Toxic Parents. And that changed everything. My whole perspective shifted. And attachment, so many people have no idea what that means. Like, can you explain for us, like in your understanding of it, what that is?
Yeah, how I look at attachment or what attachment is, it's the way to look at it is if you have communication issues, right? Let's just look at it from a very high level in the beginning. If you have communication issues, for instance, someone says something and all you want to do is charge out of the room, right? Or somebody says something that upsets you and your response becomes passive aggressive instead of telling them, "Oh, I didn't I would have rather you said this, or this really hurt my feelings." You end up saying something snarky back, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it all has to do with attachment. Attachment's how we connect. It's how we communicate with another person. And when our communication gets murky, or for instance, people that are going out there and dating for the first time, right? And they go out on a date and they're like, "Oh, the person's not compatible," or "I'm not interested in that person." A lot of times it's because of how they connected with the person. The person maybe didn't ask them enough questions, right? Or maybe the person dominated the whole conversation. That has to do with attachment. And so all that is it's learning what our attachment is, right? Are we people that like to avoid conflict because we never learned? We're adverse to conflict. Are we those that need more reassurance? Like we're more on the anxious side where we constantly need someone to be reassuring and validating us. That is all useful information because then that's going to determine how you connect, right? How you communicate with another person. So it's just knowing how do you connect with another person and then digging deeper. Why do I connect with them? And then how can I work through those issues so that I can have healthier relationships?
Yeah, and there's that great book that I've never read. It's called Attachment, but I listened to like 100 episodes on attachment theory and that book, The Toxic Parents, because it explains that. And I think people think like going back that far, why should I look at my primary relationships in life? But it really is essential. And I don't know if your experience is this, but when you're in a relationship, you're playing out a lot of those dynamics, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You are playing out those dynamics. So for me, what it was is I wanted that validation reassurance from my dad, right? It was really unrealistic expectations. My dad could never fulfill that for me. So what do I go into the relationship with? Unrealistic expectations, right? I'm waiting for someone to love me the way that I need to be loved, to admire me the way I need to be admired, acknowledge me, but I'm not asking them, like I'm not telling them what I need from them. I'm expecting that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're absolutely right. You end up going into the dynamics from your parents. And the only way to transform or to unglue from the past. And I don't use the word healing because healing is a journey for lifetime. I think we're going to all be in a healing journey, but really to unglue from, like you said, those dynamics is really to go back and revisit those dynamics. So I had to go back and revisit the dynamics with my dad. It doesn't mean that he changed, but I was able to finally accept him for the way he is. And then my now expectations have shifted with other people because of, it's just, you have to go back to the circle and really unglue from that and then accept it.
Do you feel like you had to do that outside of a relationship or just in that particular one because you didn't have that understanding yet? And my second question is, when you say go back to the dynamics with your dad, was your dad involved in that or you did it in therapy?
No, I did that outside of therapy completely. In fact, the most healing I've gotten, to be honest with you, and I'm not dissing therapy because I've had years of therapy, is really when I left therapy, because then it really forced me. It really forced me to make these changes. To answer your question, the stuff that I've done is in and out of relationships. I've been in relationships since, and the dynamics that I was able to work through with my dad, I was able to do that in and out of relationships. But I would say the most healing or I guess transformation I've done is when this is just the latest in the last couple of years when I wasn't in a relationship. And by what I mean by going back and revisiting that, it's not like, hey, I sat down and had a conversation with my dad, because a lot of people think that that's the only way to do it to get closure. Like, what if my dad doesn't talk to me anymore? What if my dad's an alcoholic? What if my dad, right? it's not that. It's me literally physically, when I went back to Iowa and I physically looked him in the face and I didn't say anything, but I just observed him. I went as an observer, not his daughter, not someone that he knows, just an observer. And I looked at his interactions with other people. I'm like, oh my God, that's who he is, Dagmar. That's who he is. So it's really getting into acceptance, but not because they're changing, not because you have to have a conversation. It's just a different way of looking at it through like a third person view.
Well, I'm always jumping in when Corey wants to jump in, but I just went to continuing legal. I'm an attorney, right? So I just went to continuing legal education on Friday. And one of the things they were talking about is lawyers love to force reconciliation with a parent, right? And sometimes there is alienation, and sometimes there are parents and children. It's a personality mix that doesn't work, right? And we think like, oh, because you're born to this person, you must have this relationship. And that's kind of the way I always thought of romantic relationships. Because I got in it, it must work, right? Like I must do everything to make it work. And maybe that's just not the case. And accepting someone as being different doesn't mean that you necessarily are going to go forward with them.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes you can't reconcile, right? Sometimes there is none of that, because it takes two to tango, right? It takes the other person to want to do it, want to be able to listen to you. And sometimes also it can be a very dangerous situation, especially if you know your triggers, you know what sets you off. And for instance, for me to this point, still being dismissed when someone interrupts, I have to always pause and say, okay, Dagmar, they're not doing it intentionally to you. They're not intentionally dismissing you.
Right.
So sometimes going back and reconciliation can be dangerous in the sense that it can really, if you have these trigger points and the person's not going to listen to you and you need to be acknowledged, it can be damaging, right, to you. And it can leave you in a worse situation. So a lot of times it's just knowing yourself, knowing what works. I know with my dad, if I had a conversation, I'm not saying anything against him. It's just, it wouldn't work. And for me, it really had to come in, like for me to see things in a different light. But for those that can't have the conversation, kudos to you and kudos to the other person. I was able to have it with my mom. That was a completely different dynamic, but not with my dad. It had to be done sort of like what I look at is if you want to change, sometimes just do things differently. So for me, it's more of what I call a living amend. I didn't do an amend with like physically talking to my dad, but I'm able to, if there's people like my dad, for instance, I'm still able to treat them with respect, right? I'm still able to be in their company. And that to me is a testament to recovery and to growth. So it's just baby steps, working on baby steps and then seeing what you're comfortable with and going from there.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to kind of piggyback on all this stuff. So, as you're talking about, you did some of this healing or your transformation or work outside of a relationship. We have situations where people are in relationships and maybe they've been in them for a really long time and something triggers them and they realize they have unresolved conflict or unresolved issues outside of the relationship but they're partnered with someone and it's really impacting that other person, or maybe they have issues with that other person. How can we balance being like a work in progress? Well, sometimes we're in relationship with someone that we don't want to get out of, right? Like we're in partnership, but we're having to go through either our individual kind of issues or couple issues. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you're right. We are always going to be a work in progress. And honestly, the best way to learn about what you need to work on a lot of times is when you're in a relationship, right? Because for instance, learning how to communicate, you might think, okay, I'm a pretty good communicator. I've been practicing with my friends. I've been in therapy. I've even been coached. But it's when you get into the real life is when you actually see, right, how well you can communicate. And also, to your point, there's times when things you may not realize trigger or set you off. You might have known a lot of things about yourself, but you're in another situation, right? So the way to work around it is the way I look at it is this. There's certain things, basis. When I say preparing to be in before you're in a relationship, I don't mean you're going to be this perfect doll and you're going to be a nun or go in monk school and just, you know what I mean? and learn everything. But there are certain basis, like for instance, example, if you're a person that needs a lot of reassurance, a lot of validation, right? Because I was one of those. I was a serial dater who needed a lot of validation from men. Or, if you need a lot of validation from your partner, that is exhausting, right? That is exhausting. So those types of things I would say, definitely need to be looked at. It would be, well, ideally would be to look at those before getting into a relationship, because that has to do with your self-esteem, and no one's going to fix it, right? No one's going to be completing you or making you happy. You've got to do that, right? Outside of the relationship. But if you have those issues coming into a relationship, right? You have the need for validation, need for reassurance. If you have a partner that is also on the journey or is willing to, see what your issues are and work with you, you can have conversations around that, and it can work, but it takes two to tango again. If you are, again, it goes back to attachment, right? Because if you're somebody who needs I'm just giving an example because I think that helps a lot of people kind of paint the picture. If you're someone that needs a lot of reassurance, but you're with somebody that also needs a lot of reassurance, or someone who's more on the avoidant side that does not do well with that, you're going to clash. And the only way to work through those is you both have to be willing to do the work and then have the tools to do the work. And that's where I come in, right? I give people tools to work. So it's not impossible that the relationships can't work, but again, it takes two to tango. And on this quiz that I have, it's called the Healthy Relationship Quiz. It's basically your attachment, and it outlines your behaviors of your attachment. It's on my website. The thing is, I have on one of the pages of the report that people get is compatibility. And it shows them, like, if I'm this attachment and I never want to do any work on myself, I say, peace out, Dagmar. I'm good. This is who you're compatible with. And unfortunately, the folks that are in the dismissive avoidant, or those that are more needless, wantless, they have a lot more distance and walls up in their relationship. Those everyone's going to struggle with. Even their own people are going to struggle with. So again, it's not impossible, but you have to, I urge people, if you can, and you're not already in the relationship, to do some of the legwork and look at some of that stuff before the relationship, so that you, one, know where you both stand, and then you can work through those. But if you're in the relationship already, it's not impossible. It's just, you're both going to have to do the work.
Yes, you're both going to have to do the work. It doesn't really seem to work when one person's just doing it. And then that one person tends to go up and the other person's left behind, and it becomes frustrating for both people.
Exactly. And that was my story. With me, I told my fiance, I'm going to do the work. I don't know what work I have to do. This was near the end of our relationship. I was planning though, oh my gosh, when we break up, as we were already breaking up, I'm like, we'll both go to therapy together, or we'll both go to coaching together, or do something. But I realized he had separate issues and I had separate issues, and he wasn't willing to do the work. And the way that I found that out is because he wasn't willing to go separately, right? Go see his own person, get his own work done. So it wasn't going to work. And that was another breaking point that I had to I came to realize this relationship won't work, because I'm going to be doing the work, and then we're going to be drifting more and more apart. And often in relationships, you see that where people are married to an alcoholic or someone highly codependent, and they start doing the work and the relationship just dissolves. It just ends up dissolving because only one person's doing the work. That powerful saying, it takes two to tango, right? It takes two to tango.
And I've been on both sides of that. I've talked about that a lot, like where I was the one who didn't understand the processing that I needed to do and the work that I needed to do. And so my partner perceived me as just unprocessed and like creating chaos wherever I went. And then I've been with other people who absolutely refuse to do any work. And, you get with them, and at first it's like, okay, this is fun for a little, very short amount of time. And then it's like, we're not on the same page at all. And I felt bad about that, because I'm like, well, I used to be where that person was, but if you're no longer there, it really just doesn't work. It just ends up being frustrating. And I've told people that I've dated, like, you really need to work through this. And they're like, well, I'm just going to be in the fetal position for 4 months if I start doing this. And I said, yeah, but believe me, you'll feel better on the other side. Like, it's weird. It doesn't seem like that. And I've been a serial monogamist for 30 years. And now I've decided I no longer want to be in that, pattern. And so I'm breaking that pattern. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I'd feel lonely or whatever. But it is strange. Like, once you have done this work, just a lot more comfortable with yourself and with your life. And it really doesn't matter if there's somebody else around, because
exactly,
you're like fulfilling yourself.
Well, and I think about that too, like even with friends, now that I've invested so much time in doing my own work and processing, I don't really want to surround myself with people who aren't willing to do the work. And like, not just in a relationship, but like I said, even in friendships, like I can feel the drift. And so it's almost like this, like sort of just this awareness, right? And like who you want to get the energy from and who you want to, exchange energy with, I guess I would better say. But I agree with you, Tracy. It becomes kind of obvious. And in some ways it almost becomes, probably a better indicator, but more difficult to find a partner because, the expectations are that I'm not just going to find anyone. I need to find someone who is committed to self-growth.
Same with across the board. Once you start doing it in a romantic relationship, you start doing it in all relationships. And
absolutely.
I mean, it is interesting. Like, it changes who you want to hang out with,
Absolutely. And the best way to practice, this is what I always tell people, is practice first. And if you don't have friendships, because I actually started over with my friends after my fiance, because all my friends were addicts, that's who I hung out with, because I was an addict and I had, went through recovery on that. That was a whole another part. So for me, it was like starting over. But what I ended up doing is just at some point, as I was getting healthier, you start to see, to your point, your friends are different. The people that you associate with are different, right? Who you want to spend time with is different. And you practice that way. And the best way is, yes, you practice in those relationships that are completely platonic. And then, you know more about yourself, about your needs, what your boundaries are, what you're willing to put up with and not. And then you can emulate that. Of course, it's a little different, but you can model that in a romantic relationship.
Well, and like, so I wonder, like with compromise, or how much compromise. So I'm noticing just between me and Corey now, when we're talking about certain things, and, we're at a time in our country's life that things have gotten really interesting and crazy. And I have a tendency to be on the way more negative, or like the doom side of that. And like when I'm talking to her now, I have to be really careful not to just hammer that in. And like, I have to know who I'm talking to, right? And and do I want to keep this relationship, or every time we talk, I'm going to be like, you're a Pollyanna, I'm a realist, and then we're going to fight, right? And so if you're more self-aware, like, I can save that for me being alone, or me being with other people who are like that, and then temper myself to be with that person. And it's interesting to do that with friends. And then it's like, do you need to do that in relationship as well? Or, like, should the relationship be, oh, we mesh completely perfectly? Is there any relationship where the people other than on TV are like perfectly meshed?
Yeah, you mean the Hollywood movies we watch all the time. They're so true, right? They're so true.
Well, I'm binging This Is Us now. Have you seen that show? It's
I have not seen that.
Lord have mercy. It's like 6 seasons. I'm only in season 4. I'm like, let it stop. And it's like, they do show the ugly side, but it's like they always fix it. And it's a little bit, it's good, but it's somewhat unrealistic. And I feel like, the Notebook. And yes, there are some people who have that. They met that person in their early 20s or whatever, and they're together forever. But like for most people, there's a lot of give and take.
Absolutely, there is. And actually, I should give you that. There's a quiz it's on compromise. I have also, because that's one that I'm still working on. Okay, work in progress, because that's a hard one, right? You want to meet someone, to your point, that meshes well with you and is perfect. We're imperfectly imperfect. There's no one like that. What I can say is the number one thing to start with where you want to mesh. Okay, this is the area that you really need to mesh with is your values. That's like the number one step, starting point is your values, right? Because like for me, what I learned, and I didn't know this, is I actually realized that spirituality, and I don't mean this like from a religious standpoint, but spirituality from a believing in something greater than yourself. You're not God, because I was with narcissists, right? That's another reason I think that value has immersed so strongly to me. And it's also because I'm a believer in meditation and really tapping into things that are, bigger and better than myself. I need someone that actually understands that. And I don't mean to the same, again, our value of that might even be a little different, but at least they don't believe that they're God, right? And they believe in something greater than themselves. So that's like the biggest starting point is the values. You have to mesh well with values. If you don't, that's where you're going to constantly have issues. And I think that's why a lot of people that are they can work being in different political, right? If you're, say, on more the moderate or Democratic side and they're more conservative, that's where it really struggles. People wonder, why is it struggle? Is it really politics? Well, a lot of it is the values. The values are not aligned. Right. They're just not. If you're not a conspiracy theorist and you're like, wait, where's God in that? And I believe in spirituality and you're a conspiracy theorist and into all that. Then you're obviously listening to something that, you know what I mean? It's not tapping into, the same values. So that's a number one. And then I would say knowing your needs in a relationship, you have to both, if you want a committed relationship, right? And they're not into committed, that's going to obviously have issues. Right. And then your non-negotiables, right? Are really important. So those are like the three areas. If you don't mesh in love languages, that's okay. It's just about knowing what each other's love languages are, right? But I would say those are the three areas that are the most important. And then outside of that, it's whether or not you both are willing to do the work, because you're going to need to, right? You're not going to meet somebody, even as much of the work we've done, we're still going to have stuff come up. Right. And we're still going to need to do the work.
Right, right. And I think about like what you're talking about are these three things. They need to be in alignment with each other.
Yes.
Whereas other things don't need to be in alignment, but you need to be respectful and understand that someone might be coming from a different place. So for instance, like with Tracy and I, we keep talking about politics. We have very much the same values. We're just having a really different experience processing what's going on around us.
Yes.
And we're trying to figure it. And I think like millions of people are. And so.
But without fighting, like without me getting like, oh my God, you're not seeing what I'm seeing, or like take it more seriously, or look at it the way I want you to look at it, or do this, and she doesn't want to be mired in what I think is really happening is too negative and dark for her to let in. Right. And part of me wants to bludgeon her with it. And then part of me is like, well, I have to maintain this friendship. So I have to take that elsewhere. Right. Or something.
Mm-hmm. Right. We just have to figure it out. Like I have to also not be so kind of try to be hopeful or find the sliver of a silver lining with her, because there isn't much of one. And so, but these are negotiables. And we're talking about this as a friendship, probably because I spend more time with Tracy than almost anyone other than my partner, is this idea that, the non-negotiable, like you're talking about, are the values are the same, but maybe we approach things differently, and being able to have a conversation about it is important. And that's the part where I know you talk on your website about like not chasing perfection. And this idea of perfection is sameness sometimes, that we're exactly the same in everything we do, everything we say, every hobby we have. And so can you talk a little bit more about maybe how we can flip the expectation of the perfection script, as you say?
Yeah. So, well, that's a great question. So perfection really, so the contrary of perfection, where it comes from, right, is unrealistic expectations. It's all the same thing. It's right, wanting others to be perfect. And where it comes from is when we end up feeling, oh, this is us, right? When we want to be perfect ourselves, in other words, if we're beating ourselves with a stick, right, or we tend to judge ourselves, we're always going to expect more from other people. right? So it's knowing, how do you treat yourself? Like when you're with yourself, right? When you're sitting with yourself, for instance, or you're spending 3 hours writing an email, for instance, that's pretty harsh. You're pretty harsh on yourself in that, right? So it's looking at how we talk to ourselves, because if we judge ourselves, we're always going to be chasing perfection, because that's the opposite side of things, is judging ourselves. Then we want a perfect relationship. The way around it is it goes to codependency. Perfection is part of codependency, which is an addiction to people. And the way that, what that means is this, okay? If you're not looking after yourself, right, and you're judging yourself, you're going to judge other people harshly. Well, then pretty soon you're going to look for that person to be a certain way, right? And one person cannot fill the boat for everything. So to your point, when you guys were talking about you being more of a realist, or maybe, you see yourself as a realist, you see yourself more, you see her more as a negative person. I'm just giving you the examples, right, from what you're saying. It's just knowing that it's knowing that one person will not fill your boat. So to your point, Tracy, there are certain conversations you may have to take without to someone else that you might not be able to talk to her about. It's not because it's walking on eggshells. It's not because, right, Corey's a bad person or she can't receive the information. It's just where she's at and where you're at, maybe two different spots, or how she perceives information or what types of information she needs is different. And so the way around it is, what I've learned is to not look at one person for everything. Because I have friends, for instance, that are more on the empath side, very highly sensitive. I've got a friend like that, highly sensitive and avoidant, by the way. She likes to sometimes go out into her world. So we have a different relationship than I have with my BFF, where she's more processed in a lot of the ways that I'm processed now, and we're able to have conversations. But at some point when we were in our relationship, right, when we started, I would keep my mouth shut and let her just process what she needed to. I would acknowledge what she's saying and I would keep my mouth shut. And if I got triggered, I would have to take it to someone else, either a professional or journal about it or use my tools. Does that make sense? Because what perfectionist runs into the issue is we're like, wow, even with a partner, you're not going to be able to process everything with your partner. It's not going to happen, because they're, again, going to perceive things differently. But it's about them letting you know, like, hey, you know what? I can't process this, or you might want to take this to someone else to talk to. That's why we have different people for different situations, and we have tools also outside of people to help us process things. And it is hard, because I know that with a partner, you spend most of your time with that person, but that's why it's important to build your support, build tools, know what tools to use for what, so that you don't drive each other nuts, and kind of go from there.
Well, and communicating, we had Dr. Heather Brown on, who talked about saying to a person, like, can you receive this information now? Or being able to say, like, I can't hear this now, or I can't do this now, but not in like a histrionic or like a reactionary way. Or, I've lived most of my life as a real reactionary person, and I've changed a lot. And that's the other thing, like,
that's huge.
People say, oh, you can't change. You're 45, you're this, you're that. I mean, that is so untrue, right? It's really,
very.
Do you have the desire to change? Do you want to better yourself? And for people who are like, I am the way I am, this is it. Like, that's your mentality. It doesn't matter. Like, I mean, your age, right? It doesn't matter where you came from. Like, if you want to progress, if you want to change, you can.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my clients I'm working with now we've been working for 9 weeks now. He's 78 years old. Okay. Wow. And I've seen change in him, and he's seen change. 78 in the last quarter of his life.
Right.
So if you say someone can't change, or an old dog can't do new tricks, whatever the sayings are, untrue. Completely. You're right.
It drives me crazy when people say that. And I'm like,
It's kind of like a cop out, right? It's the same thing when people say, well, you know what? I'm working on that in therapy. I'm healing. Well, that also can be a cop out. That can be like
Right.
making yourself not accountable. You know what I mean? And just saying, oh, you know what? I'm healing, or I'm just processing this still. Well, you've been processing it for 5 years now. So the point it's all about being accountable, and to your point, being willing to do the work and then make the decision, right? Today I'm going to change and then move forward. And that's
And
kind
I
of what I
think,
did. Yeah.
and
What a
if
lot
you're
of people can do.
if you start to be accountable to yourself, then I think you want to be accountable to those around you, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what like, I think the beautiful thing about coaching is that for me, I would feel like what do you call it? A con artist, basically. If I was just coaching people and saying, hey, do this or stop being such a perfectionist, right? And so it's important for me to be doing the tools. And the reason I'm in the business I am, or I'm passionate about it, is because I've done the work, right? I'm still in progress. I'm not perfect, but I've done a lot of the work. And so anyone can change. Honestly, I started my journey really changing in my early 30s, but haven't really seen the transform until it was really my late 30s when I started seeing change. So anyone can change.
Yeah.
If I
Well,
can do it, you all can do it. Look it. We can, that's
we can
what
all do
I
it.
hope. Yes, we can all do it.
When Tracy brings up Dr. Heather Brown, it was really interesting because she did bring up this point about this idea of, can I give you some feedback? And then the person's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
you can't. I'm not interested in your feedback right now. But to disconnect that from this idea that you are somehow avoidant or unwilling to hear the feedback, but this maybe right now is not the right time. And being more boundaried it's not necessarily like, you can't handle it or you're not willing to deal with something. But, I think about when we change, sometimes we change those little things inside of us, right? It's not necessarily, they can be big behavioral changes. Maybe, Tracy talks a lot about not being as like reactionary. So people will notice that. But like for me, I went to be more trying to, and have been growing to be more boundaried. And sometimes you can barely see that I'm doing that, but that's something that is my choice. And so as we go back to we've been talking about like the election stuff, and I'm being very boundaried about my ability to carry other people's angst because I have too much of my own. And so for me, that feels very processed, that I'm able to do that because my old self would have just taken and taken and taken until I couldn't function any longer. And I love that idea that we can change even if other people don't necessarily see it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to your point, you setting boundaries just by speaking up, right? Saying, you know what, I'm not, I hear what you're saying, or maybe not even I hear what you're saying, but I'm not able to hear what you're saying, right? And it's not about you. You can do it in a very empathetic way. It has nothing to do with you, Tracy, right? But it's just something I'm not ready to hear right now, or I can't hear right now. And to your point, some people, you all are lucky because you're not lucky. I would say I'm grateful to have this conversation with you both because you're both on the journey and willing to do the work. But those that aren't may not receive the boundary well. And it's important to look at not taking that personally, right? Because Corey,
Absolutely.
to your point, you may set a boundary. I've set boundaries where they haven't been received well. I remembered the only boundary when I started my journey that I knew how to do was distance myself from my family. And I told them in a very loving way, I cannot have a conversation with you right now. In fact, I can't have a relationship with you right now. I don't know what this is all about, but this is what I need to do for myself to grow for myself. And it wasn't well received. I got emails about me. I'm the one that's going to suffer. I'm betraying the family, right? All of that. And it was very painful, but I kept my boundary. That's another thing, right? I held that boundary still, sent them still loving cards. And now I have an amazing relationship with my mom. I have, a relationship with my dad and regardless, it's not the relationship that I want. Okay. I want to make that clear. But it is regardless, I'm able to accept him for who he is. And I know how we started the conversation. But it's because of that distance that I was able to withhold. Because boundaries are in the beginning, when someone doesn't like them, and especially someone you care about, it's easy to just say, just kidding, just kidding.
Right.
I'm not going to set that boundary. I'm not going to keep that boundary, but it's important to withhold it because it's about respecting yourself, right? Putting limits on yourself, and it's a respect for yourself, and then how people respond is on them.
Well, and I to that point, I want to say, like, it's great, like, that you took the space, you told everybody what you needed to do. They didn't quite respect it, but then you came back and you were able to have a relationship. And it's okay also if you don't. So I don't have a relationship. I have a relationship with my sisters, but not my parents. And that's not my choice. And I'm okay with that because I made peace. Now, I did work a lot of that out through a very, very tumultuous and destructive relationship that everyone was like, what are you doing? But I was like, I don't know, but I can't let go of it. And it ended up helping me work that stuff out about my parents, right? So it was very interesting. And I feel like if people were to look at me like from the outside and say, oh my gosh, what you went through this, you went through that, they might think I would be a very sad person or be using drugs or alcohol or whatever. But I'm actually super happy. And it really is. Once you change your perspective, once you say, okay, I'm looking at everything as the learning, and I'm not going to like beat myself up because certain things in this life didn't work out. Right. And for me, being spiritual, like, it's all about Buddhism and all that, but it's more like, I can't control everything. I'm going to ask to be open to what's coming towards me and to actually take it in and see, okay, is there a lesson in this? And I mean, that phrase, I hate that. Everyone's in your life for a season, a reason, or whatever, or a lifetime. I don't know, that bugs me. But like, there's truth to it, right? That like everybody that we're around, we can say, okay, what is the meaning in this? And some people you just shouldn't be around. I mean, there's some people I just do not vibe with, right? And then there's people who I've tried to have a relationship with, and it's not working. And to be okay with that also, right? Sometimes people do come back to you, and sometimes they don't. And that's okay, and not to like beat yourself up for the rest of your life. And I think it is hard in a romantic relationship to really like have two adults come together and be able to be okay with their different lifestyles, whether it be the mundane of like, how do you organize your house, or how are you in relationship with other people, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you brought up a lot of good points about, well, the first one, you don't have to have a relationship with your family to actually go through change, right? And the other one is kudos to you because you did have the choice. You could have been a victim, sad, moping, right? And you chose a different way. So that's what I have a lot of respect for people. We see a lot of people that have, or I see not a lot. I see some people that have what I want, right? Have things that I want. And that's what I modeled a lot of my behavior from. And I would question, like, how did you get that? And when I found out their story, I'm like, really? Or you were an addict, or you have parents that don't talk to you, and you ended up like that, and you're in a happy relationship. Those are the people that I want to be around, to your point. And I've had relationships that it's been painful, but girlfriends that haven't worked out. We've been friends for even years. And I got an email, one broke up through email. And I realized, well, and that didn't really surprise me, but then I realized, so why was I friends with her for so
like
so
a
long?
friend did? So it wasn't dating, it was just friendship?
No, it was a friend.
And then they ended it through email?
Yes, it was through email. But then you can emulate that. Yes, she ended it through email, and I knew she was very on the avoidant side, and it was during that time, when we were still in, I guess, our relationship, I still had work to do, right? And I did analyze that, and I did analyze and realized I was in that relationship because, again, it flashed back to what I was used to. I'm used to being controlled in relationships. I'm used to people telling me what to do. And I let that happen too long. And you know what is interesting about that? When people say I have fear of rejection or fear of being abandoned, what happened is when I was in that relationship with this person, that's where the abandonment kept getting triggered because I was never acknowledged while I'm in the relationship. Then what I realized is, and were we both willing to come? And when you mentioned compromise, I was willing to meet the person, but not have a phone conversation for 10 minutes about it, because to me, that's a wall. There is a difference now between a boundary and a wall. And so we weren't able to compromise on meeting, and I was willing to still meet her somewhere in the middle, but she wasn't willing to meet me in the middle. And I'm not willing to have a phone conversation for a limited time when it's a conflict. I really am. I need to have it in person. That's my non-negotiable when it comes to conflicts. We've got to meet and talk about it. It can be a safe space. It doesn't have to be a restaurant, right? It can be our place. But yes, and that happens also in romantic relationships, right? When people ghost you or don't message you back or break up through text. To me, it's about them, right? It becomes about them.
Right. Do that work. And if you do that work to understand that it's not about you, and then you don't spend the rest of your life beating yourself up over it, right? I think that's what happens to people who get mired in addiction or other things where they beat themselves up.
Exactly. So so ultimately it goes back to the same thing, Corey, you were mentioning about how you can do the work before and during the relationship. It's not about being perfect, but it's just having the awareness, starting with the awareness of what it is at a basic level that irks you. For me, it's definitely being controlled, right? That's a non-negotiable for me, is being controlled in a relationship, being dismissed, unacknowledged. And then being able to verbalize it and seeing how the other person responds to that. And again, you may be in a relationship where a person is going to learn and they're going to grow and they're going to be like, wow, I've never known. Maybe I do interrupt a lot. Geez, I didn't realize how much I interrupt. I'm so sorry. And I'll start working on that. So
and
again,
really what matters is that you set up, this is what you want. Yes. And how does this person react to you saying what you want? And that's really the most important. You could be like the greatest person and then it just doesn't work with this person, right? Like to understand that the most important thing, because for this podcast, I got on a bunch of Facebook groups and people put these questions out there about this happened. And it's like, okay, why do you care what 100 people think? Like, how did you feel about it? And I always just say that. I'm like, did you like it? Doesn't matter whether anybody else likes it. Like, what do you say? How does that person receive it? And I've been the horrible receiver person, the reactionary jerk, the awful. I know that about myself. And I'm really trying to change that and be a better person. And really being through relationship, I've just learned so much of that. But it is like a progression, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It is a progression. And to your point, I was also reactionary, and I did a lot of diabolical, it's DBT, by behavioral therapy. But the thing that helped me is I didn't know how to express my feelings, because if someone was going to say, oh, well, just talk about your feelings. Well, I don't even know what I'm feeling other than pissed off, angry, and about ready to, I wasn't even violent, but like throw something across the room, you know what I mean? So what I ended up doing with that is drawing. Like when I was able to tap in again to the subconscious and draw just like whatever came up, I was like, okay, now I see what that looks like. So it's, again, you're not going to find someone that's going to be perfect. They might be better at expressing their stuff than you are. But if you're like, hey, I suck at expressing, I want to get better, but this is how I can express. I can express it through drawing, or I can point to something on the wall and show you, or a painting and show you that's what it looks like. Then, you can, and see how they respond and you can still have a conversation. You might be speaking more in sign language to them and they're speaking in French to you, right? But you can still have a conversation, as long as you're willing to be respectful and hear each other out, and know, right, what you're willing. I think Brene talks about this. I do like this part when she comes into the room. Sometimes she's like, asks her husband, where are you in terms of your like able to receive? And he's like, I am at 90% capacity. I can't receive anything today. I love that. And she's like, well, I'm at 10%, in terms of, or no, he's like, I'm at 90%. I can't receive. She's like, I'm at 10%. I can receive, or whatever the numbers are. It could be switched. And so then he's like, okay, well, and she's like, why don't you tell me what's going on? Since I'm able to receive. And then when he's, at the point when he can receive, she can talk to him. So sometimes you won't be able to talk at the same time even. And I have friends like that too, where they're super triggered. They need to talk. I'm in a much better place to receive. And
Right.
I don't need to be acknowledged and heard at the moment. And other times, it's vice versa. And then if we're both in it, it might be a good time to say, we're not going to be able to have a conversation with each other at this time because we both are going to be like listening to respond, not listening to actually hear each other out.
I love that. I love that. And so I think, as we kind of wrap all of these kernels of wisdom into kind of one thing, I'm just going to ask you just, what is the secret to cracking the code for a lasting relationship? Like, what do you think? I mean, we've talked about a lot of things. Is there some kind of like a takeaway, like the aha?
The aha moment. I would say the first step of the aha moment is to completely decide and make the decision when you're, thinking about getting into a relationship or you want to have a healthy relationship is to completely break free from your past relationship, whatever that looks like, right? I mean, you might have children, so it might be a little bit different for those that have children that don't. But I would say that's the number one step is because I see a lot of the ones on the hashtag move on when people really struggle moving on. And if you're still lingering in that relationship and wanting to get into another relationship or you're in that relationship and they realizing you're still not over, the relationship is just doomed from the beginning. I'd say that's the number one thing. And then the number two is to really look into the attachment. I know we've gone into a lot of topics around a lot of different things, but they all stem to understanding your attachment. I have a quiz to understand your attachment and your behaviors at the first level. And that's where I would start is because awareness is a blessing, right? It's the key to starting. If you don't have awareness, you're pretty much just going from into the dark. So that's where I would start is really move on and start looking at your attachment.
See, perfect. And communication. It always comes back to
that. And yeah.
Do your own work in therapy and outside of therapy. It's not just therapy. Therapy's only scaffolding for what you need to do.
And do your own work all along the way. Don't ever stop doing the work. And the work may look different. Like I go through these phases of doing the work. Like, I go through these phases where right now I'm going through my intuition development phase, which I go in and out of about every, 6 to 12 months. And so I'll go through this thing and you can't, get enough of like learning about my intuitive capacities. And then I'll go into something around like boundaries. And then I want to like consume everything about that and learn about myself with boundaries. And then I'll go into things with attachment or whatever. And I kind of like, I'm constantly going through these phases of learning and deepening my understanding. And I can't even almost imagine my life without being in the cycle of learning about myself. Mm-hmm. It would feel very stagnant.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's extremely important to learn. And I think that a lot of folks need guidance in the beginning. I noticed for me, that I read a lot of self-help books. I read all Brene Brown books, but what I realized is I need guidance, right? And that's why coaches and there's people out there like myself that provide the structure. And then the way that I coach is I don't give you cookie cutter stuff and say, oh, do this, do that. This is going to work for you. You're going to tap into that as you learn more about yourself. You're going to tap in. Well, Dagmar, I'm a visual person. I need more visual. Or Dagmar, I give you structure in terms of the things that you need to look at and within yourself. But then you learn a lot along the way about yourself. And I'm actually tapping more and more into emotional intelligence lately. That's what I've been getting into is because there's a whole topic on that. And most of our most of our communication, going back to communication, is nonverbal. And if you don't look at the cues, somebody's telling you, oh, I love you. And they're going like this, or you know what I mean? The actions speak louder than words. And that's also part of emotional intelligence, looking at that, knowing what to look at. So that's what I've been learning a lot, and diving more into and wanting to expand on is emotional intelligence, because again, we've never learned relationships in school. We learned all this other stuff in the curriculums, right? But I would love to have relationships, even just if it's not at the high school level, college level, having more curriculums on healthy relationships.
That's what I said. I've said
Really?
that people should start.
Let's make it happen.
Yes. And I've said, why did people they're probably not doing square dancing anymore, but like,
I love square dancing.
Well, they still do line dancing. In Texas, they still do line dancing, but you're right. You can do dancing. You can do pickleball. I mean, that's a thing. There's teaching lessons on that. Table tennis, on engineering, right? All the STEM stuff. But the thing is, without the relationships,
we're all in relationships and we never address it. Right?
And we never address it. And so that's what I would love to see and work on, is building healthy relationship curriculums in schools. And I would love to see it starting at the high school level, getting into college, because then people can know more about themselves and know what they're getting into. Because I've heard, actually, I was on a call last year with Rice University with some folks. They have a department for relationships, and they said that they have one of the highest suicidal rates. I just heard in the news, this was months ago, a girlfriend had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend shot her and then shot himself, right? So again, it's like, it's not just about school and doing well in school, but that high stress, that perfectionist we're talking about, especially at super high achieving schools like Rice University, people having that mentality, what types of relationships do you think they're going to end up in? Probably controlling relationships, right? Ones where they're not going to be healthy. So it's definitely. Well,
I always say that. I mean, intimate partner violence is the number one cause of death for women. Yeah. So it behooves them to understand relationship dynamics and to figure out what they want, so that, you know, when the first bad thing happens, they're not there for the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, until it becomes, you know, very awful.
Absolutely. You don't want to. And you absolutely. And I have a very, I guess my heart goes out to them, because I in my 20s, I was stalked. And so I have it's a whole story on that. So my heart goes out to those, because I didn't know the signs. And luckily there's a show called Obsessed where people don't make it when they're being stalked. I was one of those that did make it. But to your point, it can be prevented. All of that can be prevented. And maybe that's what it is, right? It's about prevention.
Right. Okay, well, we'll have a whole talk about that. Well, after this podcast, because I used to be a cop and I was a public defender and I do family law. So and I worked at domestic violence shelter. So I'm very
to be continued on the next piece.
There you go. Exactly. I know. And I do all the more prevention stuff. I actually designed and ran a camp for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders called Lead You. And it was a week-long day camp about learning about yourself and how to interact effectively with others. And we built the whole thing on emotional intelligence. And it was amazing. We just couldn't get the ability to do the funding for the following years. But I have this like dormant camp just sitting there. We talked about being like the bystander effect, how to talk to people and ask questions and inquiry. And it was beautiful. And I was like, these kids are craving it. They want to learn it. And so why isn't it there? And the sad part is that we did it as a camp, right? Like we couldn't do it as like part of the school curriculum. It was not deemed essential enough. But I'm right there with you. I think we have a lot to do on helping young people figure out how to show up as their best selves in relationships, so that people can recognize signs of unhealthy relationships, but B, maybe they, people who are more in kind of perpetrating roles would be less inclined to do that.
They don't perpetuate it. And that we understand that all people are flawed, our parents, everybody, and no one ever gets any kind of training to do the most important role in their life, which is raising other human beings and or being in a relationship with them. There's no training for that unless you seek it out yourself.
This is great. We should come up with something. You've got a cop, an ex-cop, a prevention, a person that's done the prevention training, and you've got me. So I think we should brainstorm and sit down. I really believe that. Really.
All right. Let's talk. Let's definitely talk. Well, Dagmar, it's been an absolute pleasure kind of meandering around some really interesting topics. Any of them could have been their own episodes just because they're so rich. So thank you so much for being here and eliciting this great conversation. And Tracy, always fun to talk and explore. And we got a little bit of free coaching from Dagmar on you and me and our friendship. We always seem to be able to do that. But anyways, thank you so much for taking the time to be on with us, Dagmar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. This is the thing I love about the virtual world. If it wasn't for the virtual world, you and I would have never met.
Right. Exactly.
So thank you, matchmaker, even though you weren't always great to us. Thank you.
Right.
You lost some messages, but Corey was able to reach out and
Find
talk
you.
to me. I'm glad.
Well, if Corey would just pay the $9.99, it would have been fine.
No, they wouldn't restore my messages. They wipe your account, from what I knew. Yeah. So, anyways, all right.
Against all odds, here we are.
Here we are. So what I'll do is I will make sure to put contact information and your website and links to your quizzes and things in our show notes for our listeners, so they can access those. But again, thank you so much for being on, and thank you to all of our listeners. And until our next episode, go out there and rock those relationships. If you liked what you heard, check out our show notes for resources from today's episode. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram under Rock That Relationship, and go to our website at rockthatrelationship.com for updated episodes and more great information.
Thanks for listening. Now go rock those relationships.